stories turn songs into symphonies, events into memories, and lives into legends. In our crowded world, knowing your story cuts through the noise so you can make your mark, whether you want to sell more books, increase profits, or just make a difference. At Sterling & Stone, story is our business. The Story Studio podcast is where we explore ways we can all tell our stories better. And now, with the Story Studio podcast number 24, here's Johnny, Sean, and Dave.
Hey, welcome to the Story Studio podcast. Today we're going to talk about character arc. We have Bonnie Johnston back again from, you'll remember Bonnie from those amazing episodes that were much more together than the ones that we normally do. So, hey, Bonnie.
Hi.
And I'd also like to lay claim before we begin. And I don't know, I came in, I was the last of the four of us to hop in here. So I don't know if anybody has already discussed the fact that Dave's office has been rearranged again.
No, we actually haven't, but
it had been more than 6 months since the last time, so
that does look very orderly. It looks like you almost had the house to yourself to focus on.
I changed my configuration when I move.
I am actually moving. That's the thing. I don't want to tell too many people. A decoy thing,
That's smart. You're a wily man. I like it's a little disorienting. I don't really know where you are. Did you actually move locations or just what's behind you?
I might be in Redacted. I might be in another Redacted. That's all I can say.
He's in a shipping container.
You're like that dude in the last season of Homeland that had to just keep going and recording from people's basements to broadcast.
That is how I see my life ending, by the way.
Oh, I'm sure.
Or Harry Hardon in what was that? No, what was that Christian Slater movie with Pump Up the Volume?
Yes, I remember.
There you go. All right, so let's get down to business. I will say though, before we begin, that I was having a little bit of a Dave flashback because I just as many people have them. It's just how many of us are brave enough to speak out.
Has that been recognized by the government yet? Dave flashbacks is like something that officially can.
It just acknowledge Fortnite addiction, so maybe that's next.
Did they really as a thing?
Specifically Fortnite.
Yeah.
Wait, not video game addiction, but Fortnite addiction?
Or not World of Warcraft, which was addicting people a long time ago.
Okay, that to me feels like Fortnite may have leaked that story.
I think so.
Are we doing a worst show ever?
All right. So let's get to it, but let me finish the story about my Dave flashback.
When did we become such taskmasters? This wasn't even a minute. We're
Dave
2 minutes into the show.
Is I was just getting the Smarter Artist Summit together because that's officially we haven't actually said this on the show, but the 2019 summit is the last one, right? So yep. And that's officially now on sale, smarterartistsummit.com. And I was redoing the page and there's this photo of Dave hugging Nick Stevenson, and it looks very uncomfortable. Like Nick is just kind of enduring it. And I got to thinking about how excited Dave's going to be when we start talking Summit again and how he gets to come into town. It's going to be great.
The last one, though, so I will be excited. I won't ever have to go to Texas again if I don't live there.
What are the chances if we actually do if Dave doesn't move that we just never see him again? Like that's just what happens. Like we literally never see Dave again. 10 years from now, we're having our big 10-year Do you think if we got an Oscar, if we were actually nominated for an Oscar for something that Dave had a hand in, do you think he would show up?
It depends. Do I have to fly?
Do I have to fly?
You will have to fly. It's twice as far as Texas to get from Redacted all the way to California.
Well, anyway, so last chance to see Dave in person, smarterartistsummit.com. Last one in February. All right, so let's get to it. So character arc. We did one of these a little while ago on character. So maybe that's a good place to start, Bonnie, is where you think, where are we going to talk? What the differences between we talked about character and now we're going to talk about character arc?
Well, character is basically kind of trying to figure out who your character is at the beginning of the story. Character arc is figuring out who they're going to be at the end of the story. Character arc is basically the story of how a character changes by resolving some sort of internal conflict, as opposed to the external arc, which is where the character succeeds or fails at some goal by overcoming some sort of external conflict, like circumstances or an environmental conflict or a conflict with people. So I think you have to know your character first before you can design a character arc, just because you have to know where they're starting. But I think character arc is the thing that really makes your character come to life, because it's so rare that you meet a person in real life who doesn't have internal conflict. And that's basically how you give your character an internal life and make them seem real.
And
that's also no, go ahead, Johnny.
Well, sorry, just to the housekeeping stuff. I mean, just to clear up, like there was overlap between character and character arc in an obvious way, in that when we were talking about character, we started talking about arc. It was like, what is this person's sort of at the beginning aspirations, like where do they think they're going? And then plot, as I know we'll discuss here, is in a good story inexorably tied to the character arc, that those two are twined like a braid.
And I think the better that you understand not just your character, but the full arc of that character, then you could do a better job piecing together an appropriate backstory. And once you have that backstory, that's when your writing gets a lot better, because you understand this person, and it means that your dialogue isn't so stupidly on the nose, and you're able to use subtext because you understand history that people have with themselves and with each other. And so if you have two characters and they're talking, and one of them gets really hurt, well, you can, the on the nose dialogue thing to do is, you really hurt my feelings, right? But how many of us, I mean, some of us say that, but it also depends on the situation. But a lot of times you say, you really just hurt my feelings, without saying you really hurt my feelings. You say it in your body language, you say it in the other words that you choose. And the better that you know the history between people, even if it's just the history someone has with themselves, then the more layered your dialogue is going to be, the richer that subtext is going to be.
You might also say, you hurt my feelings by flattening all four of their tires.
That's very true. Thank you, Dave.
Here's my contribution for the show. Go ahead.
That was really good. Do we owe you any sort of bonus for that?
Yes.
I think what you're saying about subtext is really important, because I think a lot of people really want subtext, and it seems very mysterious. The subtext is always coming from just what the characters want that they can't talk about, or what their secrets are, or how they feel about each other that they're not comfortable expressing, and all those like hidden resentments or hidden desires. And all of that comes from backstory. Backstory drives character arc. Backstory ties character arc to the external arc. And a lot of times when we come up with a character, we're like, oh, here's my character. And the backstory starts coming to us kind of intuitively. So that's always the place to start looking for character arc, is like, if you have this idea of a person and you know that they lived through this terrible event, or you know that they had some terrible thing happening with the villain in their backstory, that's always a good place to start for character arc, because that's always going to be how you tie it together with the plot anyway.
Where would you differentiate? Where would you draw the line between character arc stuff in the way that you're talking about and backstory? So when Sean was talking about like subtext and stuff, I got to thinking about a project that we have that's about secrets, and there are ways that there are subtle things that happen in the subtext when one character is talking to another at the very beginning of the book that you don't know why. You're just like, boy, this person just seems to have a problem with this other person, and you don't know why. But it isn't really character arc. It's a little different. It's more like what happened in their past.
Right. I think you can think of backstory as the context for who a person is. Basically, you have a person, they didn't grow up in a vacuum. They had all these influences that you don't see when you meet them at first. But all these influences from the backstory are driving them to think in certain ways and do certain things. And then I think out of that comes like the interpersonal conflict that you're talking about. It starts with who they are and who that other person is because of their backstory. So I don't think it's a direct connection. I think it's more of a how you're using backstory to shape each of the characters, and then you kind of smash them together like Barbie dolls and G.I. Joes and see what happens.
Okay, so where's maybe a good place to begin with our discussion of character arc, Bonnie?
Well, I think that, one of the places that I didn't used to start, but I've started recently, is trying to think about like what the emotional experience I want the story to give the reader, because your character arc is your reader's primary. If they're bonding with the protagonist, the character arc generates the primary emotional journey of your story. So on the book that I'm working on now, I actually started with what is this emotional journey that I want the reader to go on, and I want it to be a journey of someone who who's been who should be a leader, but because of what happened in her backstory, is someone who feels very uncomfortable being in charge. She feels very uncomfortable building a team or working with other people. So I wanted them to have that experience of like coming togetherness as the series progresses. So starting with that, I was like, okay, how do I give the reader that journey? It's like, well, I definitely have to have her be isolated. I definitely have to give her reasons why she's not comfortable working with other people. I have to give her reasons to be suspicious of other people's motives, right? So thinking about that as a journey of where I want her to end up with this like circle of people that have built this really awesome team and these really awesome friendships. Starting there made it really easy because then I know what she has. She basically has to be the opposite at the beginning. And so I started designing the character around that.
So when people are normally building characters, one of the things that I think that they do, especially when you're first building characters, I mean, I was super, super guilty of this in the earliest days. What makes my character cool? Right? What makes my character cool? What makes my character different than other characters? You know, what makes my character stand out? Like, but you're thinking of almost like affects, right?
It says
like,
beer, better bullshit all the time.
No, exactly. No, that's a really good example because at first, you know, so Dave is referring to the Mauricio character. And I like that was the first thing that we wrote. And it was very experimental and we didn't really know what we were doing at all. And we had that, like, there was character design for Mauricio, but I was not in any way experienced at what I was doing there. I knew that I basically had to take what I knew I was good at, and I could give Mauricio a certain voice. I could give him this real alliterative, like scary voice. And so that's where the focus was. It was an affect. I basically gave him like an eye patch or something, like the verbal equivalent. It was something that like,
he looked pretty damn cool with an eye patch.
Oh, we gave him an eye patch in season 3.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
I remember when exactly Sean told me that, and I kind of rolled my eyes.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and that's definitely something that I was doing when I first started writing. Is like I misunderstood quirkiness or giving characters like really strong, distinctive things to make them stand out for personality and character arc. And so I would build these characters who, like Mauricio, they had like these really distinctive things about them, but it implied depth and complexity. But then as the story progressed, because I hadn't actually thought about what was going on inside the character and thought about why they feel the way they did and why they were so strongly motivated to do certain things, it like quickly became apparent that the character was like all style and no substance.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with starting with style, but then you have to go, okay, given that this character has an eye patch or given that this character might almost be a serial killer, it's like, how do they get that way? And you still have to dig down and figure out like how and why and build the character arc around that. And you can keep the cool, flashy stuff. And that could be your starting point. That's okay.
We did do that.
Yeah, it very much was. I mean, Mauricio really did get the development that he deserved. But in the very beginning, I think that was earned because the readers, you know, raised their hand and said, we want to see more of this character. But they wanted to see more of his affect, not his development. And Dave thought he was a little gimmicky at first. But, you know, as he became a deeper, richer part of the story, and as we grew as storytellers, we naturally, I mean, and it happened fast. Mauricio has a backstory, I think, in maybe the last episode of the first season. Like, it happens quickly that, okay, now we have to explore where this person came from because he's, you know, going off the deep end. And we knew that backstory mattered, that what Mauricio needed as a human being mattered because he wasn't just a mustache twirler, right? And so, but I think it's that growth from like, what would make my character really cool to like stop trying to give you your character leather jackets and figure out like where they need to be better humans. What will make them whole? What is missing from them? Because that's how you can say, here's where the story is going to end or begin, and here's going to end. And it's not, I mean, we've seen this in all the stuff that you give us as feedback. It's not just a character arc for your your main character, which is obviously important. But you want a character arc for your villain. You want a character arc for your smaller characters, because they all play together, because everybody then has what they want. So do you want to talk about the need for like global character arcs and not just in terms of what everybody knows? Yeah, your main character has to have one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's actually a good trick. If you've got, if you're writing a big series and you're starting to introduce characters now that you know you're going to use in 3 books, like just don't figure out everything about them, but just figure out what you think their character arc is going to be and write them from that perspective. They will seem deep and rich and developed. And so by the time you get to the point where they're going to play a big role in the story, the reader is going to believe that, yes, those characters were real all along. They're not going to be like, what? All of a sudden this guy is important and he just seemed like nothing before. But I figure out for my villain has a character arc, and usually they're failing it. Or if they're going to succeed it, it's because I'm going to redeem them later on. I don't always do it with secondary characters, but if the secondary character has a relationship with the protagonist that's important, I always do it for that secondary character, because I have to know why they have that kind of relationship and how they're going to kind of feed off each other. And that's the other thing, is relationships are the best way to show character growth.
Yes.
If you've got a character arc and you're like, I want to show the reader my character has changed, but I don't know how to show that. Like, how many scenes can I have them sitting around thinking about how things are different now? It's like, no, don't do that. Give them somebody that they care about, whether it's a good relationship or a bad one, and show how, as they start thinking differently and they start making different choices, that's affecting that other relationship. So that,
are you saying that that's better than just having their alarm go off and having them wake up thinking about things?
Just marginally.
Because that always works, doesn't it? Okay, so I think you'll think this is really interesting. So we've been doing the rapid iteration stuff and trying to develop how quickly, fluidly, and structurally sound we can get our outlines in a short period of time. And the very last one that Bonnie did for us, we had, I think, every time we pass a new outline through, we want at least one significant takeaway. What is our big lesson learned from this version of this story from doing this outline? And our big one this time was, Bonnie needs to come earlier in the process. So, and this is a big takeaway, because we have been giving you stories when they're pretty fleshed out at the very end. And then you'll make some very wise observations that require so much rewriting, which is good. That's the point. That's like, I'd rather have significant rewriting on a 20,000 word outline than a 100,000 word book, of course. It's also easier rewriting because you're not going in and changing dialogue and stuff like that, which is a little more surgical. It's on the story level. But we had this going. So we had this draft go to Joel first for like what we call like a color pass, where he's giving us some ideas. He's basically giving the story a leather jacket. Right? Because Joel's very good at that. Oh, this would be cool if you did this and this and this. So we gave it to Joel. It came back and he suggested a bunch of stuff that required rewriting. And then we gave it to you, and all of your stuff was character arc based, all of it. And so of course, and it all made sense. It was all great, but it meant that we had to go back and completely gut a lot of what we had. And we had, I think it was does that sound about right? About 14,000 words in there.
Could have been, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a long one.
Long. Okay, it's 23 right now after your storage jacket. So we lost several thousand words, added a shit ton more, and now it's ready to write. I'm actually starting that book on Sunday. And awesome. I feel really good about it. I love everything that you suggested, but it told us very emphatically that this is a pattern that we're seeing, that there's little tweaks that we get after, different feedback comes back in, but yours always require the most substantial rewriting because they're at character stuff that really, if we had figured that out at the beginning, it would have made Joel's work much better, because he's adding color instead of, structural things. And it's exactly the same advice that we give to anybody who wants to give their work to an editor. And we say, well, when do I give it to the editor? As soon as I'm done with my draft? No. You give it to your editor when you can't take it any further, when it's as good as you can get it. So that way your editor, who only has finite time with the draft, can spend all of that time to make it the very best possible instead of just correcting your most obvious errors. The same is true with story. So if we gave it to you in, like from my thinking has always been, let's take it as far as we possibly can. And then Bonnie can help us take it that last bit of the way. But that's the wrong thinking, because character arcs are so foundational. They should be coming more at the beginning of the process and not at the end. And the rewrites were significant enough that we finally really identified that pattern this time.
Cool. And actually, it's funny. I was actually going to, I've been thinking I wanted to talk to you because we were talking about doing some character arc training during the summer to kind of help people in company outline. And I think the number one thing that I'm commenting on in Story Jackets is the character arc is not setting up the climax. If we talked about how the character arc was going to set up the climax at the beginning, maybe even before you start outlining.
Yeah, as part of the initial story meeting process, even.
Yeah, I think that you have, and I think a lot of the people in Sterling and Stone who I'm seeing their stuff, I think they have an intuitive grasp of character arc just from seeing so much. But I think not having made those decisions about how it's going to set up the climax, it ends off going in another direction, or it ends up being really weak, or it just ends up.
Or you have to drastically rewrite because you have to reroute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Can you talk more about that? Because, character arc setting up the climax is exactly the sort of thing that I think that a lot of people don't do and that we've had to learn over time. I know that I've told this story a few times for the OGs who remember discussion of the Dream Engine when Sean and I were writing it live, when we realized at the ending we were just going to kind of get to the thing and then she was going to fight and whatever. And then we were like, but she didn't grow. She didn't have to conquer anything to do that. And that's, I believe, what you're talking about. So can you delve a little deeper?
Sure. And that is exactly what I'm talking about. Is like looking at how at the climax, your character is actually succeeding by making a different choice than they were at the beginning of the story. It's like your character arc, if you set it up in terms of thinking about internal conflict, like your character starts off being cowardly and they move to being courageous, for example. Let's just say your character needs to learn to be brave. So at the beginning of the story, and as they move through the story, they should be, every time you have a scene, that scene should present the character with a dilemma. And the biggest dilemma is at the climax, of course, but each scene's dilemma, the character should have to choose, am I going to do the cowardly thing or am I going to do the brave thing? And as the story progresses, the character should be making fewer cowardly choices and more brave choices. At the climax, the only way they should be able to defeat the villain is to earn that victory by making the bravest choice you can possibly force them to make.
And the villain can be themselves. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be some person who has designs against your hero, right?
Absolutely. It could be the bravest choice the character could make. Could be like, I'm going to go to AA tomorrow and I'm going to stop drinking. That could be the bravest choice for them. So like whatever your story's about and whatever you need them to overcome in the external world, at the climax, you have to look at how that presents the character with a dilemma that forces them to choose my old way of doing things or my new way of doing things. And that, I think, is what, if we started looking at that before the first outline gets written, and we're like, we know this character has to jump off a ship and save someone and beat off a bunch of sharks, or we know that they have to decide not to take the movie career that would, or the movie role that would make them but would also destroy them sanity wise, or whatever it is. There has to be like, how is that making that choice the choice that embodies the new way of being that we want them to be at the end of the story. So, and everything else, I think, falls out of that once you see that dilemma.
Well, so let me give you something that you can agree with or disagree with or something. But I know that a lot of people always talk
disagree. I want to fight.
But it is character arc based, and it's certainly how I proceed, is talking about the second act in a 3-act structure. The middle, approximately half of a story, is the part where people get hung up. Like they're just like, well, what do I do? And the way that I tend to look at the second act is a character attempting to get the resolution they want using an old paradigm. So as you said, the cowardly choice, or at least the old choice, their old way of doing things. They're trying to. It's like the that definition of insanity. Like the definition of sanity is you keep trying to do the same thing, thinking you're going to get a different result, and that's what the second act feels like to me. Is this person with their old kind of broken paradigm banging their head against a new problem and not getting it. And then in order to have the success, they need to realize, oh, I need to do this differently. And that's the character transformation that occurs that you were just talking about.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think you could break it down. You could look at, if you're using 4-act structure, you could say act 1, the character is stuck in their old paradigm, but it's working for them. Act 2, once they reach that first plot point and they're thrown into the new world, they're doubling down on the way they've always been, but they're in a new world, so it stops working, and they start getting punished by the world for being the way they've always been. I think the midpoint where you're getting that game-changing realization is also the point where they start to realize, in order to play this totally different game that I haven't even been playing, I'm going to have to try a new strategy. And they're awkward and clumsy, and it often fails because they're not good at it, but they at least start trying to be a little bit different. They try and step out of their comfort zone. Even if they're not recognizing literally, oh, I have to be brave now, they are recognizing, oh, this thing I keep doing isn't working. Let's try somebody else's suggestion, or let's try this new idea. And then the act 4 with the climax is basically where they realize, okay, I'm not great at this yet, but I've got to double down on this new choice if I'm going to defeat the villain, because the old choice has just been taken away from me as a good option. I mean, they can still choose it, but they recognize it's taken me to the dark moment where everything seems lost. And it's really clear to them at the dark moment, or it should be, that the way they have always been is what got them to this place of total despair.
Do you think that there is a level of maturity in storytelling when you get to a point where you can be confident enough that you are just putting character first, no matter how crazy, or because a lot of people, I mean, I'm definitely in this category of person. The idea comes before the character, right? It's like, what if this happened? What if this happened? And it's so much easier to start scraping at the surface of the idea before settling down and thinking, okay, well, here's my character, here's what he wants. So what we're finding, the more, I mean, what have we done? 50 outlines this year? I mean, there's a lot. And so we're aggressively telling stories and aggressively trying to get better with every single outline. And we've learned a lot in that time. And I think that we're seeing over and over that the sooner we come to taking it character first, the better the story ultimately is anyway. And when we don't do that, we have to double back and figure that out anyway. So it does feel less fun. This is a little more like, the difference between outlining and pantsing. Pantsing is more fun until you learn how to make outlining fun. Pantsing is fun because you're like, I'm just going to make it up as I go along. But then you realize that, okay, well, if I make up the outline as I go along, then, I could still shoot from the hip when I'm writing, because now I have this structure in place. But now it's even one more degree removed, where the outline itself now is requiring a little more structure because it will make it all better. So do you think that that's like just earned behavior?
Well, I think it's possible to be a really good writer and not have a lot of confidence. And I don't know if it's a plot or pantser thing, but I know for me, I can be in the middle of a draft and second guess my story. And the way that I don't give up and start over again is I look at the structure. I know the structure is sound. I've had other people look at the structure, just keep writing, just finish it.
Do you think that would work for Dave?
I don't know.
Dave, do you think that would work for you?
No, I don't know.
Like, different people need different things. And I don't know. Dave might be a really good rewriter. Some people are actually better at rewriting than they are in writing a draft. And if that's the kind of person that you are, then yeah, write the terrible draft, get the feedback, and rewrite it. And it takes more time sometimes than going from an outline. And like, I have like panic attacks if I have an outline because I need that structure. But I think that confidence comes from wins. And like, if you just keep trusting in the process and you keep doing the things you need to do to iterate to get better, I think the confidence eventually comes. I don't know. I think it might depend on what kind of a person you are, whether knowing your character arc is right gives you confidence. It might. But I think that we all enjoy different parts of the process. Like, and you're saying like, oh, pantsing is so much more fun. Whereas like, I'm like, oh, pantsing is so much more scary because I have a blank page and I have no idea what to put on it.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't think you have to be confident about yourself necessarily as a writer. But I do think once you really understand a story and you know what you're trying to do with it, you start to get confidence in the story. And you start to be like, okay, maybe I'm not brilliant, but like I know what this character wants and I know what has to happen at the climax. And I love what my villain is doing. And I think for me, when I do have confidence, it actually comes more from having really grounded myself in the story and what my characters want and need and how I want them to change. So it could. I don't know if that was a good answer.
Well, no, I guess that does answer it. I think that for everybody, it is different. We're all really unique. And, even the way we articulate stories is different, but also the way we internalize our process is different. And so I think the takeaway there is that your process should never be done. You should always be, how can I get better? How can I understand story more? And maybe you're an ace at character arc and this isn't really your area to work on. You have areas to work on, right?
Absolutely.
So what is it that you can figure out? And that's it. Every time we write it, every time we finish a new outline, we want to do an autopsy. What worked, what didn't. We need to understand it. We need that fundamental knowledge so that we can make the next project better. It's not just how do we write books better, but how do we pre-produce books better. It's every part of the process needs improvement, and that really requires paying attention. But yeah, over and over and over, it's coming down to arc as being the most important thing. And so yes, I mean, you can expect to see outlines on an earlier basis, which will probably be great for you because they're less time consuming. You're like, oh, I can identify that now, right?
It probably will save us a little bit of time in iteration.
On your end, on both ends, for you and then for us, because we're rewriting less, we're catching our mistakes faster.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's dead air. Well,
that was a long side.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's so much to say in character. Well, okay, so let me ask this then. What mistakes do you see people making with character arc? Or maybe another way to put it is, how do people, like, we see a lot of like kind of cardboard cutout characters, and how do we avoid those other than just giving them more detail? Like, how do you make a character that people care about, that they want to root for?
Gotcha. And actually, character arc is a fantastic way to create sympathy and empathy for your character, because you're basically letting the reader see those vulnerable moments. Vulnerable moments are where character arc kind of erupts on the page. In terms of like mistakes, the biggest mistakes I see are, first of all, the character arc not really being tied to the external arc. In other words, the character is not being forced to confront their flaw or their wound by what's happening to them in the story. And that's something that happens in Acts 2 and 3 if you're using 4-act structure. And the other thing is just not having enough internal conflict and not structuring the internal conflict the right way. If you structure your internal conflict correctly, when you put it in the story, it naturally feeds into external arc. And we talked about like the dilemma that each scene is presenting you with. Your character, in every scene, something should happen that changes the story meaningfully for the character. Like their situation should change because of something that happens in that scene. As soon as something changes meaningfully, you need to have a little cycle: reaction, dilemma, decision, where your character's like, I react. It's like, oh no, that thing just changed. I just realized that my boyfriend is cheating on me, or I just realized that the gun I have is not loaded and I'm about to go into a shootout, or whatever that thing is that changed. Right. They react. Then they have a dilemma. It's like, well, do I break up with him? Do I go look around for another weapon, or do I keep moving forward? And then they have to make a decision. And that decision is going to be either the old way or the new way. And if you just look at every scene and say, what major thing happens in this scene that changes? And then how's my character going to react? What's the dilemma it poses? And what's the decision they make as they move forward into the next scene? And it can be very short. It doesn't have to be, you've seen people talk about scene and sequel. It doesn't have to be like a full separate scene. It could be like a couple paragraphs within a scene that you're writing where they just go through that quick cycle of like, oh shit, should I run or should I fight? And then they decide I'm going to fight.
Yeah, so Derek Swain's The Techniques of the Selling Writer is the best book that kind of lays this out. It's super dry, but it does a really good job of this foundational nuts and bolts action reaction type of arc stuff.
Yes. And once you understand that there's a structure to it, it becomes very simple because you don't have to go like, how do I show my character's internal conflict? It's like there's a formula. They have an emotional reaction. They mentally debate A or B, and then they make a decision, and that pushes the action forward. And if the decision doesn't affect what they're going to do in response to the external arc or the external events, then it's not a good dilemma. And you've started to let your external arc and your internal arc diverge. So if you just understand that, instead of having a saggy middle in Acts 2 and 3, you understand like in every scene, something's got to happen. It got to go through this little internal conflict cycle. You're keeping your character wound up emotionally, right? Because they're constantly facing these dilemmas. And hopefully, if you're doing it right, they're difficult decisions to make. They're not easy. And then by the time you get to the climax, we've seen the character go back and forth, like be brave or protect myself and do the cowardly thing. We've seen them make have that internal debate and make that decision over and over again, so that by the time we get to the climax, we totally believe that they've actually changed because we've seen them try to change. We've seen them fail to change. We see them sometimes change and then get themselves into more trouble during Acts 2 and 3.
And then what about characters doing things that are out of character? So a lot of times you'll say, like, how do you avoid that trap? Because I know that there's been a dozen times or so when I've been watching something and I've been like, wait a minute, that just doesn't sit right. And then if you actually stop and think about it, it's like, well, that's not really what that character would do, even though they're a fictional character. There are rules that are, set out in expectations.
Yeah, right. You can't ever say, well, that's not realistic. It's fiction. That's not really a good enough answer.
Yeah, well, and I think in Act 1, you have a responsibility of setting up who the character is and showing what rut that they're stuck in, showing the wound that's keeping them stuck in that rut, so that you're basically setting up the character arc. Once you've got that, that's your guide throughout the entire story. Whenever you don't know what your character would do, go back to that dilemma, be brave or be a coward, and say, given the context of this situation, like they have options. Should they go down the garbage chute into the trash compactor, or should they try and shoot their way out through the stormtroopers? Well, what would be the brave choice and what would be the cowardly choice? And then that kind of guides you throughout the whole thing. And character arc isn't everything. You also have like personality traits, which are basically habitual patterns of behavior. I mean, your character is going to have quirks. They're going to have contradictory beliefs that they hold for whatever reason that they somehow rationalize or justify, that are also going to guide their behavior. So the character arc, that's a primary guide. But I mean, it's not like if that's all you do, the character becomes kind of monotone. They never actually have any depth or complexity, and they never have any variety. So you can also take a situation where you're like, yeah, this character arc is driving, but maybe this quirk is influencing whether or not they be brave or stupid, or how they're going to be brave or cowardly. Or maybe their personality trait is getting put under some pressure, and they're like, maybe your character is obsessive compulsive, and somebody there is like, don't you fucking dare do that obsessive compulsive thing. And then they've got to be brave or cowardly in a way that like also is deformed by the need not to be who they actually are.
Been there.
Yeah. Dave, because character seems to be a natural instinctive thing for you, but I think it's natural instinctive in the way that Bonnie thinks that most of us in this company are pretty instinctive at that kind of stuff, our story and character, but it's at that 80% when you're actually, I mean, you don't actually design arcs like that. You may have it in the back of your head what you want for character A or character B, but are there difficulties that you have, or Bonnie, knowing Dave as well as you do, are there suggestions that you would give to Dave? Because again, I think Dave is a stand-in for a lot of our authors out there. I think a lot of people, he is their spirit animal, and they identify. Yeah, and he has a soggy middle. So Dave, this could go either way. Like Bonnie, would you have any suggestions for Dave? Or Dave, do you have not quirks, but like limitations when you're coming up and trying to figure out how does this character relate to this character or anything like that?
I don't have problems with interrelations. Right now, as Bonnie's talking, I'm sitting here taking notes. Might be the first time ever on this show, by the way, that I A, paid attention, and B, took notes.
I feel honored.
But I'm thinking about, I'm finishing up White Space 3, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't know if I'm doing all these things. I'm like, oh, fuck. And I'm trying to think back, and I'm like, oh shit, I'm going to have to go through some stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, but see, that's the whole.
Bonnie's just rewritten all of Dave's shit. He's not going to do anything now. Everything you have slated to publish, Sean, forget about it.
I think you ruined Dave. Yeah, no, but see, Dave, that's why we always say, like, now, Bonnie is part of the company. We need to get a story jacket. Like that's the whole purpose.
Did we get
to
one
that.
on White Space 3?
No,
I don't think.
No, we didn't. Well, we actually didn't on White Space 3. And we talked about it. And the reason we didn't is because there was just, first of all, it's a serialized format. So it's a little bit, the rules are just a little bit different. And we had 2 prior seasons of a lot of stuff that's already been set up. I thought it was asking too much of you, Bonnie, to say, hey, figure all of this stuff out. So but yes, the thing that we're starting next week, you will absolutely be involved in, and earlier in the process than we've ever done before. So yeah, we're real excited about that. But we didn't want to burden you with White Space. Dave, please don't overthink this shit. I will die. I will seriously die. Don't do it.
He's pulling everything.
I know. I completed half the book.
He is going to have a nervous breakdown. Just for context, everybody, this is due on Sunday. Okay, like as in the day after tomorrow.
Quick, I have to add a dog.
Right, this book is 2 days away, and I am positive Dave's going to have a nervous breakdown sometime around midnight on Sunday.
Yeah, I better get the Xanax out.
Well, if it makes you feel better, Dave, the stories of yours that I have read already had a pretty clear implicit character arc. Like the suggestions that I sent back on the Dead Baby at Christmas story, I wasn't really trying to get you to change the arc. The arc was there. It was just very subtle, and it needed to be brought out. And
there's nothing subtle
what's
about
this Dead Baby's motivation?
Well, but in terms of what the characters were doing, the husband and the wife, their character arcs were kind of in there. They were just they were not spelled out, and they were not brought up to the surface.
Yeah, Dave's great at character. It's very natural at character. But
to be fair, that was a story thing I did that I had no interest in doing.
Right. He originally wrote that outline for Stories to Go, and then felt resentful that I was making him do it.
Well, I think that's like the cat shitting on your bed, right? Dave's like, you want a story, bitch?
Yeah.
All right. So are we done talking character arc, you think, here?
Yeah. My only closing thoughts would be just please don't underestimate it. And we're learning to put it as an earlier and earlier part of the process. And, if that's a really common occurrence for us, it's probably at least somewhat universal. Like maybe your projects, if you're listening to this, would really improve if you moved it up higher as a priority. And I'd love to hear how, Bonnie would close this, because she's better at this stuff than anyone I know.
I think I would just close it by saying, don't be intimidated by character arc. There's a lot of stuff that you hear about it. You see people talking about it in very complex terms, and especially when they're dissecting stories. But if you really just think about your character, it's like, what's the old way? What's the new way? How is that a dilemma? And just don't try to you don't have to get fancy with it. You don't have to show like these amazing moments of strong emotion. Those will actually naturally show up if you just have an idea of what the character is being caught between. It's like they're just being pulled in 2 different directions. Know what those 2 different directions are, and think about how they're eventually going to give in to the better direction as they're being pulled forward through the story. And it doesn't have to be more complex than that.
All right, so we're actually recording these out of order. For those of you who are listening, Bonnie will be back 2 weeks from now to talk about how to story jacket an outline, which is basically a developmental edit at the outline stage. It's a lot of the stuff that we were talking about when Sean said getting involved earlier and looking at things earlier. So we're going to talk about that. And on the next episode, for those of you listening, sort of following along, we're going to talk plotting. And thanks, everybody, for listening to the Story Studio podcast, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Story Studio podcast. Are you wondering what the ever-growing demand for superb storytelling skills means for your future? Check out our latest interview as Johnny and Sean dive deep into that question in Storytelling is the Future, How to Build on Your Self-Publishing Success. Download the interview from the info box or show notes in YouTube, or head over to sterlingandstone.net/future.